I'm Don Dickson, and I want to thank you again for joining me for another session of my structure fishing workshop. The last time we got together, we talked about what Buck referred to as the basic movement of fish. We established that fish live out here somewhere in the lake. They're in the shallows, deep, somewhere in between. We also established that they spend most all of their time in deep water. And we talked about that good average depth for a home area for a largemouth bass would be somewhere around 30 to 35 feet. This is where a fish reaches stability from the changing environment. So we covered all of that, and some of my friends up in Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin, some of my northern friends, including Pennsylvania and western New York. A lot of my subscribers are fishing natural lakes. And most all natural lakes have a weed line to some degree or another. Lots of lakes have weeds growing to about 6 feet. Some other lakes might have their weeds growing to a depth of 10 or 12 feet, maybe 14, sometimes 17 feet. And in some of those most northern areas, there's a lot of those natural glacier lakes that have a 20-foot weed line. So the question comes up when you're discussing this daily movement of fish, what Buck called the basic movements of fish, that occur during the summer months once or twice every day during the summer when these fish become active and move. He referred to that as a basic movement of fish. And we described it in pretty much in detail last time we talked. And we said these activity periods or these movement periods take place once or twice on a normal fishing day during the summer months. So a lot of my northern friends say, my lake has a weed line. And I want to know how this weed line affects this basic movement of fish. Well, a couple of different ways we have to look at that. First off, when we're talking about a weed line, we're talking about a submergent weed line that grows to a certain depth and comes to within a foot or so of the surface. And these natural lakes that have these weed lines, many times that weed line will be grown to 6, 8 feet. Sometimes it's 10 to 12 feet. Other times it's 14 feet, 17, sometimes even as deep as 20 feet. And it becomes important for us to understand how this affects that basic movement of fish. So let's take a look at this question. How does a weed line affect the basic movement of fish? Fish in deep water, they become active, and let's say they migrate. And let's say they're migrating under excellent weather and water conditions. Even though my lake has a weed line, let's say it's growing to a depth of 6 feet. When the fish move up, does the scatter point under excellent weather and water conditions, does that scatter point still remain at 8 to 10 feet? Or do they come up all the way to the edge of the weed line? Well, no. 8 to 10 feet, that's where the big fish put on the brakes. Don't ever forget it. They're reluctant to move into the shallows. But as we touched on last week, Buck says when those fish become adults, that's somewhere over 2 pounds, about the time they reach 3 years of age, they are reluctant to go into the shallows. They can't adjust to the fast-changing conditions that exist in the shallows. So they're still going to put on the brakes there at 8 to 10 feet. And even that is under a perfect, excellent weather and water condition. That's it, as far as they go. Now the smaller fish will move in a little bit, maybe move into some of that weeds that you have there at 6 feet. But the big fish are stopping at 8 to 10 feet. That's still the scatter point. So let's back up and say your weed line cuts off at about 10 feet. So when the fish become active and move under excellent weather and water conditions, they will stop at the outside edge of that weed line, which is at a depth of 8 to 10 feet, which is their normal depth of their scatter point to begin with. But that would be their new stopping spot. Smaller fish will move back in the weeds a little bit, 1 or 2 good fish on occasion. But the mass of the school, the mass of big fish will remain on the outside edge of that weed line. That's the new scatter point. Now let's go with another example. Let's say the weeds in your lake go to 14 feet. Do the fish move on migration and come up and penetrate those weeds to a depth of 8 to 10 feet and scatter? No. The new scatter point in your situation is 14 feet. They'll come to the edge of the weed line to where that wall of weeds exists, and that becomes their new scatter point. And that would be at a depth of 14 feet. Now, how about if I have a deep weed line? It's 17 feet or 20 feet even. Do they penetrate that to establish a scatter point within the weeds? Answer, no. When the big school of big fish move up in that situation, they will stop at that 17 or 20 foot weed line. They'll stop at the outer edge of that weed line. Smaller fish penetrating maybe in, a few big fish on occasion, but the bulk of the school of fish, when we're talking hundreds of fish, they're going to stop at that outside edge. That's the new scatter point, even if it's 20 feet. Now, keep in mind, these fish don't know that it's 20 feet. They don't know it's 8 to 10. They don't know it's 14. It's just how they do it. When they see that wall of weeds, when they arrive at that wall of weeds, that becomes their new natural stopping place, where the smaller fish will scatter in and the big fish put on the brakes. Now, another way to figure out just why that is, it's one thing, Buck always said, it's one thing to make a statement, deep water's a home to fish, but why? You have to explain scientifically why something occurs. And that was his whole mindset in all of his material and all of his curriculum. That's how he approached it. Now, when we're talking about how the weed line affects the basic movements, and I said the new scatter point, if your weeds grow to 20 feet in your lake, in the first place, what I'd do is find a new lake. And I'll explain that in more detail later. But let's just say your weed line's 17 feet, 20 feet, and the fish stop right there. Here's a good reason why they do that. In order to grow weeds, you have to have light. Light penetrates the water. If you have a dark yellow-green watercolor in your natural lake, the weeds only grow to about 6-8 feet. If you have a medium yellow-green watercolor, your weeds may grow to a depth of 10 or 12 feet. But when the weeds are grown all the way to 17 or 20 feet, you have maximum light penetration to grow those weeds. The translation of that is you got gin clear water. Now we're going to talk about clear water and light penetration and all that stuff in our study on weather and water conditions. But for now, let me just put it to you this way. The fish move to that 20-foot weed line and they stop. Under even excellent conditions in a gin clear lake, that's a good movement of fish, getting them to 20 feet. And again, some of the fish will scatter into the shallows. And this is one of the reasons we hear all that nonsense from time to time with people who are living in Minnesota and upstate Michigan and Wisconsin. They talk about, whoa, every fish I catch in the weeds. Well, the fish have moved. The school of fish stops at the outer edge of the weed line, and the other smaller fish, with an occasional big fish, penetrate the weeds. So if you're always fishing in the weeds, you're going to catch some fish from time to time. But I did want to explain how that affects the basic movements, whether you have a weed line to 6 feet, 8 feet, 12 feet, 14, 17, 20. It affects it. But the scatter point will always be 8 to 10 feet unless the weed line is growing to a deeper depth. And then the outer side of that weed line, this is my conclusion now, the outer side of the weed line will be your new scatter point. That's how we conclude this discussion of how basic movements are affected by weeds. And don't fall into that trap when you read those glorified stories about how the fish are living in the weeds in my lake. No, they're not. No, they're not, friends. And let me just divert myself for a minute to give you, or should I say remind you, for those of you who have been with me, when my partner and I fished that muskie tournament way back in whatever it was, 77, 78, 75, I don't even remember when it was, so long ago. But we went to a lake we'd never seen before, and it had a 17, 18 foot weed line, 18 feet I think it was, gin clear. And all of the so-called best muskie fishermen in the world, this was an international tournament, they were all there. And every last one of them were throwing their big baits up into this massive bunch of weeds that were growing to a depth of 18 feet. 250 anglers that caught 0 fish in 2 days. That should tell you something. And a couple of young punks at the time, me and my partner Tommy Francis, we went out there in our little 14-foot boat with a little small engine on it, and we caught 4 muskies, all over 20 pounds, one almost 30. We won everything that you could win in that tournament. We were the only ones who caught fish. We caught 4 fish, and every fish was caught between 37 and 45 feet. Nowhere near the weeds. We were fishing deep break lines, and we caught 4 big fish. And 250 of the so-called best anglers didn't catch a one. And, you know, it's not because they never caught a fish. It's not because they're all dummies. They just were fishing where the fish weren't. Going back to Buck's statement, you can't catch fish if you're fishing where they ain't. And they spent 2 days fishing in the weeds, thinking those big old muskie live in the weeds. No, they don't. The bigger a fish becomes, the deeper he is. The average sanctuary for a muskie, by the way, is 55 feet. That's the average of where he's located, the school of fish. And yes, muskie school too. That's a whole other discussion. We'll do it later, but I wanted to give that example. You can't catch fish if you're fishing where they ain't. And if you expect the fish to always be in the weeds, you don't have much of a chance. In most all cases, that school of big fish is going to be stopping before they get to the weeds. That's a fishing fact. Now, during the spawn, which so many of the bass tournaments fish during the spawn, and the average fisherman is witnessing on ESPN all these fish being caught in the grass, lily pad, stick-ups off of somebody's dock, you know. You just see it over and over and over and over and over, and pretty soon these young fishermen out there get the idea that fish live in there underneath somebody's dock. I want to end this discussion by telling you what Buck shared with me years ago, and then after 48 years of my fishing, since that time, working for Buck, and even after in my semi-retirement fishing, I can honestly say, of all of the fishing that I've done, as he told me back years ago, of all of the fishing that he did during the bulk of the season, there was only 2 or 3 times when he caught more than 1 big fish in the shallows on a movement and activity period. In maybe 20,000 days on the water. He only experienced that twice. And when I look at all of my fishing, which spans 48 years from the day I met Buck Perry and started doing it the right way, I can only remember one time when I caught 2 big fish up in the shallows during a movement migration period. They just can't handle being in the shallows. Well, people say, well, we see them up there during the spawn. Yeah, survival of the species. They have an urge to spawn and to continue the species. They have an urge. It's almost like it's an overwhelming urge that takes place with the fish. They don't want to be up there. I can promise you. That big old girl, she doesn't want to be up there spawning. But overriding urge to spawn takes over. The reason she doesn't want to be up there is you got all the predators, you, me, all the different animals and the eagles and all kind of predators from the outside, number one, that put that fish in a vulnerable position. And then number 2, the changing environment. And in the spring, it's changing minute to minute. If something's changing minute to minute, it's very difficult. for a fish to just move in on, fan the bed and stay there until everything's complete and then move on out. They hardly ever do that. They'll be on it one day and off. Cold front comes through, they're off to bed, then they're back in. They can only stand so much. And fortunately for you and me, they're able to stand it at least once a year. And then we have this survival of the species. We have fish spawning. And once that spawning urge is complete, and it's all over, and they're back on out of there and downstairs where they belong, where they reach their stable condition from all the environment, they're feeling real good. But when they're up in those shallows, they got a bellyache. I'm telling you right now, they do not like it. So in order to conclude this little basic movement and this sort of introduction to successful fishing, let me ask you this. If Buck spent 25,000 days on the water and I spent 8,000 or 10,000 days on the water, and we're talking about fishing all over the country. I think I fished in every state but 4 states last time I checked. I fished 4 states. I've been pretty much everywhere. I fished those reservoirs and the natural lakes, and I fished for bass. And never did I find the entire school of bass beyond the scatter point. Not one time. Not once. Buck said he could only say that he had seen them twice. Only twice. And I never saw the school of fish beyond 8 to 10 feet. I've had them to 10 feet, but I've never found them beyond 10 feet. And those times I found them to 10 feet were not many. That's a rare occasion to get an excellent movement to 10 feet. Doesn't happen very often. So, as we move forward off of this basic movement, I want you to understand the basic movements, because everything we talk about for the rest of the entire study, everything always comes back to the fish becoming active and moving. We don't need the fish to bite. We need the fish to become active and move. You don't need the fish to bite to catch them. You need activity, though. You need those fish to become active and move. And then we're going to catch them. Now, we can't leave basic movements until we also bring up the seasonal movements. So the next time we get together, I'm going to be talking about the seasonal movements of a bass, how we attack that, and how they do it, and how we can pinpoint and identify those fish during the spawn, actually during the pre-spawn, the spawn, and then again in the late fall. I appreciate you. Thanks for being with me today. I hope you learned a little something. I want you to be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. We need you to subscribe. That way we're going to get our message out to more and more people. So thanks again. Appreciate you being here, and we'll see you the next time.